Ah, now it's on. Let's try that one more time. His goal is to advance a justification for the blame that we commonly attribute to those who fail to live up to their obligations, not by choice, but through raw inadvertence. Now, this goal of George's is one that Michael and I also pursued in a recently published article entitled, quote, "Punishing the Awkward, the Stupid, the Weak, and the Selfish, the Culpability of Negligence," a politically correct title. We too sought to make sense of our own practice of condemning and often punishing our teenage son for his daily inadvertent failures to fulfill obligations, both negative and positive. Now, like George, we recognize that it's often tempting to trace unintentional omissions to other morally relevant choices so as to in fact blame people for those choices. Because of course if someone chooses to take an action which when chosen is known to risk, later unintentional omissions or unchosen harms, then we can blame the person for that later failure because we can blame him for the fully informed prior choice to which it can be traced. But the goal, of course, is to justify the common intuition that blame is appropriate in some cases in which no morally relevant choice is available. Now, in our paper, we explore whether the blameworthiness of an actor's inadvertent wrongdoing might be piggybacked onto the blameworthiness of personal traits, personal flaws, which may have caused the inadvertence. And so we explore the possibility that people are responsible for having imperfect motor skills or for having flawed cognitive, conational, and motivational traits. And George does a bit of this same kind of analysis in the early part of his paper when he explores whether we can blame people for unintentional omissions when and because they reflect certain motivational defects, like, for example, not caring enough or not psychologically placing enough value on their affirmative obligations. But here's the problem. Even if we were to find it blameworthy, for persons to possess all of the physical, cognitive, conational, and motivational flaws that often cause inadvertence, we would not have provided an exhaustive account of the circumstances in which many intuitively place blame on people for causing accidental injury and for inadvertently omitting to meet affirmative obligations. Because there appear to be freestanding failures that don't owe their pedigree to physical, cognitive, conational, or dispositional defects. George's own biographical example of inadvertently failing to meet his first class in a semester is seemingly just such a case. Or take the tragically common case each summer of the mother who, for understandable reasons, forgets her child is in the back seat of her car and who thus locks up the car on a sweltering day, leaving the child to die. We can imagine that some unusual change of routine has occurred that has resulted in her taking her child to his daycare center en route to the office. And we can imagine that her day is an unusually stressful one so that her thoughts are on the day's activities as she drives her familiar daily route to work, oblivious to the fact that she's just missed the early turnoff to the daycare center. And we can picture her parking her car in a shaded parking structure without removing her sunglasses, and therefore without noticing her sleeping toddler in his car seat in the far side of the darkened back seat. And we can understand how too much time might pass in a high-stress, busy day before that sort of heart-sinking memory of the child in the car might float to consciousness, making his rescue too late. In just such a case, there's likely no defect in motor skills upon which we can blame the mother's inadvertence, and there may be no cognitive impairment, no conational defect, no dispositional flaw of motivation that accounts for her failure to recall this unusual obligation on this unusual day. She may have been a characteristically selfless and devoted mother whose failure to remember that her beloved son's welfare rested in her hands on that stressful morning was wholly out of character. So absent any ability to pin the blameworthiness of her inadvertence on the blameworthiness of her character or any other obvious physical or psychological attribute, can we nevertheless blame her for unintentionally omitting to extract her boy from a coffin, from a car that was fast becoming a coffin? Now, Michael and I, and Larry and Kim, think the answer to that question is no. We can't blame her. But if the answer is yes, then it seems clear that we don't have a full menu of grounds upon which people can be held responsible for inadvertent omissions, inadvertent actions. So now the stage is set for George's grand entrance, and a grand one it is, because it boldly purports to base the culpability of unintentional omissions precisely on the uncharacteristic failures of practical reasoning capacities. If sustainable, George's thesis will indeed allow us to cast blame in all cases of freestanding unintentional omissions. So in George's view, a person who unintentionally omits to fulfill a positive obligation can be held responsible if his inadvertence to that obligation was caused by the interaction of features that generally make him reason responsive, features that sustain his broader rational and volitional capacities. So as he puts it in his book, a person's causally effective subpersonal states are so closely related to him that it is reasonable to view the failures to which they give rise, and so by extension the ensuing wrong or foolish acts, as originating in him. In George's view, we should take each responsible person to be constituted not merely by her consciousness or her reason responsiveness, but also by the set of physical and mental features to which consciousness and reason responsiveness are themselves intimately linked. My basic idea, as he puts it, is that a responsible agent is best identified not only with his subjectivity or rationality, but also with their causes. So if an unintentional omission is caused by a physical or a psychological or physiological state that's constitutive of the agent as a responsible agent, then the agent can be blamed for that omission. And as George says in this paper, even if each member of a given collection of constitutive states is either morally good or morally neutral, their interaction may still cause an act or omission that is itself morally bad, in which case one can be blamed for that omission, as George blames himself for missing his class, and as many would blame the good mother for leaving her child in the hot car. So George appreciates, certainly in his book, that inasmuch as his account identifies responsible agents with whatever psychological and physical structures sustain their normal patterns of intellectual functioning, it's clearly at least an analog to a character theory of responsibility, a theory that takes one to be responsible for all actions that are the product of one's character on the basis that one just is one's character, and one can be properly blamed for what one is, even if one never chose to be what one is, or one could never have chosen otherwise. So George explains, however, that what sets his theory apart from familiar versions of this view is its causal nature. One is responsible for all things caused by the psychophysical structure that sustains one's ability to make the sorts of judgments that are the hallmark of being a practical reasoner. Now, if George's account is defensible, then we should have little difficulty in blaming the mother for her unprecedented failure to remember her sleeping child in the back seat of the car. Because however unprecedented that failure was, it was presumably a product of aspects of her psychophysical apparatus that generally determine the contents of her conscious thoughts and her deliberative activities, and that thus function as consistent contributors to her exercises of practical reason. And as such, she can be blamed for her unintentional omission because it was caused by features constitutive of her as a responsible agent, features without which she would not be an agent at all. Okay, so this is a very edgy, very smart, very in-your-face, very bold to the point of cocky thesis. This is a sexy thesis, right? So as a result, I love this thesis. Or at least I would love it if I could morally motivate it. And there's the problem in a nutshell. George just doesn't feed our moral appetite for a means of normatively motivating his causal component so as to make it plausible to think that people are rightly blamed for the causal consequences of psychophysical attributes about which they never may even have been aware. To find George's thesis convincing, we'd have to find it plausible to say that just as we can legitimately blame someone for a wrong if she chooses to commit it, so analogously, we can legitimately blame someone for an accidental injury or for an unintentional omission if What? If the psychophysical apparatus that causes our chosen actions also caused this unchosen result. But in the case of a memory lapse, for example, why is its causal pedigree morally relevant? I mean, if George considers it prima facie morally illegitimate to hold the mother responsible for her child's peril, when that peril doesn't enter into her all things considered judgments about how she should act, how are his moral concerns assuaged when he discovers that her forgetfulness is a causal product of the physical and psychological mechanisms that cause her all things considered judgments when she in fact makes such all things considered judgments? I simply can't understand why George takes his causal component to be a morally relevant addition to this case or to any case. Wherein lies the culpability? Wherein lies the true blameability in possessing physical and psychological structures that have causal powers with regard to our actions and our omissions when we didn't choose them, we didn't cause them, we can't unchoose them, and we're sufficiently unaware of them often enough or sufficiently unable to predict their malfunctioning so as to be able to take measures against their adverse effects. I mean, I'm morally starving here. Now, while George leaves those of us who are morally hungry with that much of a meal, I can imagine two related arguments that might, on first impression, make it morally palatable to strap actors with the causal consequences of their psychophysical structures. And both of these arguments appeal to the moral desirability of preventing unjust enrichment by forcing people to internalize the costs of characteristics and capacities from which they often derive benefit. So on the first very straightforward version of this argument, we get the benefits of possessing physical and psychological abilities that allow us to sort of navigate through this world, pursuing goals of our own devising, so we ought to bear the costs of those abilities when they function imperfectly and cause others injuries. That is, we ought not to get to internalize the benefits and externalize the costs of being sort of perambulatory practical reasoners on pain of being unjustly enriched at others' expense. Now, on the second extended version of this argument, one might believe that as a general matter, one can never get the good without the bad, that every vice is the flip side of a virtue, that every weakness is the flip side of a strength, and that every failing is the flip side of a success. So one might argue that it would be impossible to prevent the psychophysical failures that result in occasional unintentional acts and omissions without giving up the psychophysical tendencies that are important contributors to the more frequent problem-solving successes that agents enjoy. So, for example, you might think that to make the mother so attentive to her child that she would never forget him in the back seat of a darkened car on a busy day, we would have to strip her of admirable career ambitions or cut into her generally impressive ability to focus on problems with singular intensity, or make her more fretful and therefore less bold, or make her less hasty and therefore less energetic. If the weaknesses in the psychophysical system that cause inadvertence could be cured only by undoing the strengths of the system, then one might be morally motivated to think that people should keep their strengths, but they should certainly accept responsibility for the weaknesses that are the causal byproduct of those benefits. The problem with both of these arguments is that if they were defensible, they would justify a kind of moral strict liability for any and all injuries caused to others, because they would not provide an account of why actors are culpable for unintentional omissions. They would simply provide a rationale for thinking that it's fair to hold actors responsible for such failures without a finding of culpability. Now, this might be a harmonious argument within various arenas of law, for example, the domain of tort law, in which many are drawn to the view that unjust enrichment can occur without culpability, and when it does, it's appropriately cured through compensation. But this would be a decidedly atonal argument within the arena of criminal law, because punishment neither undoes unjust enrichment, nor is it a deserved response absent a finding of culpability. And it seems of equally dubious merit within the moral arena, in which blame alone is at stake, because attributions of moral blame appear to require findings of culpability, and one cannot extract those from findings of causation, however clever one is. So absent any other arguments that would make moral sense of George's intriguing effort to pin people with the causal consequences of physical hardware and psychological software that make them successful practical reasoners, it seems to me that we must conclude that we simply have no means of justifying the blame that is commonly attributed to persons who unintentionally omit to meet their affirmative obligations, at least when those omissions are the product of uncharacteristic and unpredictable inadvertence against which they could not have reasonably taken precautions. I, for one, would take our dead end here to heart and cut George a break for missing his class, as his very wise department head did. I would suggest that George is suffering from an overdeveloped sense of non-moral guilt, and that rather than seeking further philosophical means of justifying his self-flagellation, it might just be time for a little bit of therapy.
Just a very quick reply so people can. Just a very quick reply. Overdeveloped sense of guilt. Yeah, and I feel guilty also for not feeding Heidi's appetite for moral enlightenment. So let me just try to, in 1 minute, sort of restate how I see the issue. Heidi finds it hard to swallow the idea that people can be blamed for the causal consequences of their psychophysical attitudes, traits, features, and so on. And I mean, that's not a wrong description of what I think, but it's maybe not the most perspicuous description. So let me give another one. So what I think is that people can be blamed for their omissions. Now, their omissions do happen to be the causal consequences of, et cetera. But what I was blameworthy for is missing my classes. And what the mother is blameworthy for is leaving her child in the car to die. Or, see, I do it in terms of a dog, yeah. It's that overdeveloped sense of guilt again. But she's responsible for the omission. Now, so there are two questions. One is, what are we blameworthy and responsible for? My answer, omissions. And then there's this separate question, yeah, but so there's the omission and then there's us, and how do we make the linkage? And will is, if there were a connection of will, I don't know why we understand that so well, but we do understand it pretty well. But the question is, in the absence of any volitional connection, how do we make the connection? And of course, the proposal that I advance is that we're linked to our omissions by their causal link to the facts about us that make us us, or the features that make us us. And so insofar as there's sort of moral enlightenment to be gotten here, I guess it would be the insight would go something like this. On the one hand, consciousness, what goes on in our conscious minds and our acts of will and our judgments of value, like they're all really important aspects of it, and nobody denies that. But also, I think maybe some, yeah, people do deny it, so people can deny it, but I think also a pretty good case to be made that like there's more to us than what goes on the conscious surface, way, way, way more. And so the proposal is that we want to do justice to both those things. So we want to do justice to the importance of what goes on in the conscious surface, and we want to do justice to the fact that the insight that we have this depth also. And so I think the case for the view of responsibility and blame for omissions that I make turns on the idea that the best way of doing justice to both those thoughts is to say that, yeah, there's the down there part and there's the up here part, and the connection can only be causal. There's got to be a connection. The connection can only be causal. And so causality comes to the forefront. That's all I'm going to say.
The drill is I'm taking numbers in a queue. I already have 3 esteemed law professors. They're just better. They're better at this stuff than the rest of us. 17, 16, 6. Philosophers coming first. 6 and 30. All right, so I have Professor 11. Professor 11. That would be me. So
I just want to start right at the beginning, and that's, I hope, a good place to start. So, and this is a way I think you also argued in your Who Knew. You start off with these examples, and then you construct a theory to account for what you want to say. And like Heidi, I think the example that you begin with, the one about Columbia, it's a really hard borderline case. I wonder what your level of credence is on the level of intuition that you are blameworthy, you are responsible. I think you used an adverb like surely or something like that. I just don't think that's a very good place to start. I'm very conflicted about this kind of case. Surely it's not as clear a case as someone who thinks, why should I go to class my first week? I have tenure, So that's a clear case. Your case strikes me as very unclear, and among other things, what's unclear about it, and there's really quite a bit, but one unclear thing is whether the kind of blame or responsibility that you're pretty clear that you merit is moral blame or responsibility. There's certainly something reprehensible or defective about what you did, but I wonder whether you think that, whether that tracks moral blame. So it just doesn't seem to me to be a viable place to begin theory construction.
Well, so, on one hand, thanks for the absolution. It's nice after all these years. On the other hand, I'm not quite sure how absolving the absolution is, because reprehensible sort of sounds, has a kind of judgmental, condemnatory cast to it. So I'm not even sure that you, you think I should retract the surely, but yeah, you're right. If it didn't seem to us that people are often blameworthy for omissions that they neither intended nor will, then yeah, then life is easier, right? Then philosophical life is easier. I wouldn't want to rest the case for trying to find a grounding for this kind of blame and responsibility on any one case. So in the book I give 9. And what I say and what I believe is that, yeah, people could sort of disagree about some of them, and probably nobody's going to accept all of them. But it's kind of hard to, I think, kind of hard to avoid the sense that that in the full range of omissions where people fail to do stuff that they really morally ought to do, that they're off the hook just across the board. I could go through some of the other examples, but this probably isn't the venue. But I don't think too much rests on any particular example.
Number 13.
Number 13. Lucky 13. So let me thank our organizers for this, because George, unbeknownst to you, your book was in the Sikkim Himalaya in 2010. Because Heidi and I were trying to figure out what does George think as we're writing our article on negligence. So we're going back and forth on the Hurd thesis. And I'm happy to report to you that other climbers in this high altitude expedition said, well, we're both nuts, and this guy George, whoever he is, must be nuts too. It doesn't make any sense to us. But
Hey, yeah, they were all right, too.
I think this, actually, now you've got to understand your position a little better. So, when you say, now, Heidi, we're not blaming you except for the omission, that's fine. And they say, now we need something else. You say, what we need is to connect the omission to the agent. And I think that's the root of the difference between you and Heidi, and I guess I'm on her side. I'm happy. Namely, I don't think that's a second question. The reason it would require a will is because a representational state, like an intention or a belief, recapitulates the wrongdoing you're obligated not to do in your own mind, so that what makes you culpable is wrongdoing in your own head. There's nothing like that for inadvertent wrongdoing. The question is, what's the substitute? So it's not a search for perceptual or constitutive features of the person. It's rather, what is it in addition to the wrongdoing for which you're held responsible, including not doing things, that's a substitute for wrongdoing you're held. So try this example. I was going to blame Heidi for not speaking loudly enough at the beginning of her talk, because she couldn't be heard, and she's obligated to speak loudly enough to be heard. Now, it's true it was an equipment failure. The mic wasn't on, but she used the mic quite successfully to express her practical reason to us the rest of the hour. Now, you say the mic's not constitutive of her, so does it matter if it's a larynx rather than a mic? Does it matter if it's the practical reasoning capacities behind the larynx exercising itself? I'm with her. I don't get why equipment failure of equipment we normally use to express ourselves, like right now, makes us responsible.
Well, this is the farthest reaches of the extended mind thesis, right? I mean, it's not just sort of tablets and iPhones that are parts of our minds, but microphones. I mean, I'm not too worried about that because, as you say, microphones are instrumentalities for expressing our thoughts. But by the time we get to the thoughts that are to be expressed, I think all the interesting work is already done. So you describe what goes on in willing as a reconstruction of the act, of the sort of projected act in our heads or something like that. Willing involves that, and that given that feature of willing, it makes sense to connect agents to their acts and omissions if the willing is present. I guess I would have two questions about that. One question is, it's Heidi's question thrown back at you. What's so obviously morally relevant about the fact that the agent has reconstructed a version of the act in his or her head prior to doing it, and that willing involves that? I mean, the suggestion was, oh, now everything's clear. Now we've got the reconstruction part. Now we understand how the agent is connected to the act. But it's not the reconstruction, the mental reconstruction of the act that seems to be doing the work, right? It's that somehow the agent puts himself behind the reconstruction of the act by making the reconstruction come true or something like that. And I haven't really thought about this too much, but it does seem to me that there's a question about why that should shed light on the idea that we can blame the agent for the act. But even granting that, there is the question about why that should be the only way of linking the agent to the act. I mean, it gets back to Doug's question about the intuitions. If we say that's the only way, then there's a big class of cases that many people seem pretty confident about where there is blameworthiness. And we're just not going to be able to do it because the will just isn't going to be able to do the trick. So I wonder both about why will is as important as it is and why it's the only thing that's important that way.
36.
Well, the question I had, well, first place, I just am not sure why you insist on blaming yourself. You know, I was with Heidi, it sounded like more of a case for therapy than for blame. But let me ask a variant. I was going to ask a variant of a question that Mike talked about, the microphone versus the larynx. What about just perceptual failure? So we absolve people of blame frequently. Surely in the criminal law we do for mistakes of fact. And you can put this in an omissions case. Why didn't you didn't see the child drowning in the pond, and you say, well, I looked, but it looked just like some old clothes that had been thrown
So your perceptual abilities, which normally allow you to navigate through the world and act as an agent, they, for various physiological reasons, you processed what you saw in a way that was not representative of what was really happening, and that led you to fail to rescue. Now, would you blame the actor in that case? And if not, I mean, if so, it sounds to me like a reductio here. But if not, I want to know what's the difference about perceptual failure as opposed to the other kinds of failures.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer to that question. It's a hard case. But I think I had cases like that myself. We drive a Honda. It's got like a bit of a blind spot on the right. These cars do. And I mean, many of the time I change lanes and there's somebody over to the right. I didn't see him and so managed to avoid accidents. But it's often occurred to me, how culpable would I be if I didn't somehow wasn't alert? I think I didn't hammer on his horn at the time. And I guess part of the issue lies in the question of whether we're talking about the distinction between sort of the reception of information and the interpretation of information. I think you sort of mentioned something like that distinction. And insofar as it is an interpretive question, I think it falls under the, insofar as there's a failure to interpret input that got in, I think it falls under the general rubric of blameworthiness that I'm committed to. Insofar as it's a failure of a perceptual system that means that there was just the information wasn't there to be interpreted, I think in a way that's a harder case.
Can I just elaborate? I mean, so let me give you a pure interpretive example.
Yeah,
Take
okay.
a mirage. Why didn't you give the person water when you had a chance? Well, I saw the water up here on the highway, the way it was up ahead. And so I didn't think I needed to. Now, it seems to me that's an interpretive failure, but it surely doesn't seem culpable.
Yeah. I mean, there's another factor that hasn't been introduced yet, but it may help here, and that is that in order for a person to be culpable for not doing something, let's say, the person has to have violated some norm or some requirement to the effect that he should have. And the operative norms and requirements, I mean, they have limits. There are things which it would be really good if we did them, but most people wouldn't be able to do them, or it'd be unreasonable to expect a person in your one's circumstances to do them. And so in that case, all right, you didn't do it. You didn't notice or didn't realize or didn't interpret the situation right. But if the right interpretation is one that it would be unreasonable to expect someone in your circumstances to come up with, then you're off the hook. And you're off the hook not because we only get blamed for things that we voluntarily do or omit, but rather you get off the hook because there was no operative norm that you in fact violated. So it may be a case like that, and Mirage may be a case like that, I'm not sure.
17.
May I ask, I like the number system, but I think we should all identify ourselves, at least for the sake of the students who don't know us.
Professor 17.
Professor 17. George, some of my constituents were working completely well, and I was having trouble hearing some of what you said. But I wondered, so you, at one point you were talking, you drew a distinction between general capacities and their capacity to, say, think to do something on a particular occasion. And what the view that you only need the general capacity, that it didn't have to be the case that you could have thought of checking your calendar that day, or no? And depending on the answer, I would hope to follow up.
Something like that. I wasn't able to respond to the reason that I had to be in class that day.
You weren't able to.
I wasn't able to respond to that reason because it never even crossed my mind that I should be. For the class began that day.
But I wonder if that presents a problem, because, so think about, so you didn't go to class.
Yeah.
And, you know, you have a general capacity to attend classes. But it seems like if you're to blame for not being at class, you also have to have had the specific ability to be in class that day. So suppose you were happily sipping drinks by the pool, but unbeknownst to you, the bridge was out and you couldn't have gotten there. No, that would seem to get you off the hook for not being in class.
Yeah.
So you would need, so to be blameworthy for not being in class, it seems you need some kind of ability to have done it then. And I wonder if you want something like that, the ability to have thought, or the capacity. You could have thought of checking the calendar, not just that you got the general capacity, but you could have thought of it then. So I wonder if something more than a general ability is required at one point, is it not also required at the other?
Yeah, certainly that. I mean, the bridge being out example shows that shows that we need to make some distinctions among sort of local or particular incapacities, right? So I had the general capacities. If the George Washington Bridge had been closed, and there's no other way to get to Jersey, say, then my inability to respond to my reason to be in, my particular inability to respond to the reason to be in class certainly would have gotten involved. That's certainly right. So there's a kind of inability to respond to the particular reason that does get me off the hook. And I want to say there's another kind that doesn't, and so it would take some analytical work of the kind that I'm not going to attempt right on the spot to distinguish them. But yeah, clearly something like that is required.
16, and let's follow Holly Smith's idea of identifying.
A little bit, yeah. All right, I'm 16, Holly Smith. Perhaps this has been answered already, but I'm wondering whether you've left yourself in a position not only to excuse too many things, but not to recognize excuses when they do exist. So cognitive scientists tell us all the time, for example, that our processing capacities are quite limited. What that means for me is that it's a good thing that we don't believe every true proposition. Because if we believed every true proposition, we'd be unable to process that information and so on. So we're quite limited in the numbers of beliefs that we can have and entertain and so on. So it's part of our system as cognitive practical agents and so on that we have these various limitations and we operate within them. Not having true beliefs about relevant circumstances is one of the offshoots of that. So here we have a system that's generally good, but sometimes works for ill. And you want to say when it works for ill, when let's say I have a false belief about something and so I omit to do something or I do the wrong thing in virtue of that, I'm to blame for it because after all that's part of my constitutive features. But we surely recognize many cases of ignorance as ones where I am indeed excused from doing the thing because I didn't realize what the impact of my action would be or whatever. So I'm wondering how you can handle that, and I'm concerned that you might go either two directions. It seems to me problematic. So you might say, well, certain kinds of ignorance excuse us and other kinds don't. And then you might be running into what epistemologists call the generality problem, which is how do you non-arbitrarily pick the level of description which you're going to use in any particular case. The other is that you might invoke, as you did, I think, in answering Larry, that a certain kind of ignorance falls below the norm that's expected of you. But then there's going to be a question of, well, do you have an excuse for falling below that norm? And if so, how do you fill that out? So it's those kinds of questions that I'm interested in.
Don't take that away, because I want to ask Holly a clarificatory question. It would help, in thinking about the question, it would help to have an example of a sort of failure to recognize something that is traced to some feature of our cognitive makeup that's a good thing we have.
Well, I hadn't thought of an example, but suppose I'm out on, I'm practicing with my gun, I'm out on a target range, I aim my gun at the target and I shoot and I don't see that there's something behind this target, and so unfortunately I shoot this person, injuring them. And it's a feature of my perceptual and cognitive system that I can't see through solid objects.
Right. So, and why is that a problem for my story?
Well, what I'm worried about is that it seems to me it's certainly an acceptable, maybe even a good-making feature of our perceptual and cognitive system that it doesn't have this particular capacity. Usually that works in good ways to support our functioning as practical decision makers. Sometimes it leads to bad actions, as it does in this case. I shoot and kill somebody inadvertently. But you're not, I mean, you want to grant that there can be a wholly good system that results in some bad actions, but nonetheless those actions aren't excused because they derive causally from this constitutive makeup.
On this particular example, I want to go to the root of saying that the norm, there's no norm that is violated by the shooter. That is to say, there is no norm to the effect that you should refrain from pulling the trigger when there's someone in the way that you have no way of seeing and you have no reason to expect to be there. You're just he didn't wake you up. So the question is whether this doesn't come up in that particular case.
Yeah. Okay, well, we could argue about this and what you're going to say about that, but I don't want to, other people have questions, so.
We'll be able to take one more question, and that's 6. And you're going to argue. I guess that's what we're thinking of.
I'm Dirk Urban. So, this is a slightly different spin on Heidi's general point. So, I think the way you bill your accounts in terms of a certain kind of conservatism about practice. So we have these tendencies to blame in the kind of situation we were talking about in the initial classes. But it seems to me that there's actually kind of 2 possible revisions of practice that are at stake. One is revising that initial judgment of blame, which some people are advocating. Another is it seems to me that it's part of our practice that we justify particular blaming in terms of explaining the particular failure in terms of volitional or affective deficiencies in the person being blamed. And so I'm just wondering, I mean, the thing is, if you in this case, I mean, the way you set it up, there's no affective deficiency, no deficiency in caring that you point to. There's no volitional deficiency. So, are you really trying to explain the failure in terms of a physiological problem? It seems to me if you're doing that, then that's a really radical revision of practice. So then you have to set up that revision of practice up against revising the initial judgment. Maybe the conservative would actually go for revising the initial judgment.
So what exactly am I stuck with? I mean, so I want to blame the agent, that is me, for not doing what he should have done. And clearly there was some sort of malfunctioning in the dynamic system that generally allows me to do what I ought to do. Is that something I'm stuck with?
No, that's fine so far, but it's not a volitional deficiency, it's not affective deficiency.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that, aren't you stuck with saying that there's some sort of physiological deficiency without a relevant psychological correlate that explains the omission in this case? And that's
Yeah, I guess so.
that's a very radical division of practice. That's not something we ever do. Right? So it seems to me that if you're conservative about practice, that you, at this point, you can be driven to, at least there's good reason to revise the initial
Wait,
judgments.
what practice am I proposing a revision of?
Our practice of justifying blame. That part of the practice. Okay, so we never justify blame in terms of purely physiological features that don't have psychological correlate.
We never deny that either. What we say is, you didn't show up for classes. You're to blame. The explanation of why you didn't show up to classes is you forgot. Okay, that's where we stop.
Yeah, but that's not where you stop. If you yourself, because you at this point, consider like what the deeper reasons for forgetting might be. And you say, well, there's no affective deficiency here, there's no volitional deficiency here, and so at that stage of the justification, I think you're forced to cite some purely physiological deficiency without a psychological correlate. And
I guess it depends on what's involved in sort of going against practice. Look, I'm making a proposal that is not common in literature. So yes, this is not our practice to offer this proposal, but I don't see that it's inconsistent with any aspect of our practices.
well, it's not something we ever do when we try to justify blame in this case. And sometimes blame involves a certain kind of dialogue, the kind of dialogue that you and I just had. So in the end, you might want to, the person being blamed says, well, how do you expect me to be different? And in the end, you're going to have to say, it seems to me, well, I expect you to be physiologically different. And it seems to me that's not a feature of our current practice of justifying blame.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that. I would say, the way I expect you to be different is I expect you to remember. And that's all I say.
Well, so it seems to me that dialogue goes beyond that. You yourself allow the dialogue to go beyond that.
That's right. There's another level to the account that I'm proposing. And I guess it's not part of our ordinary practice or discourse. And I guess the question between us is just how radical a departure is that.
So we have to stop because of time constraints.